The wind on the ridge above Hollow Fork carried the smell of cold iron and turned earth, and Ellen Marsh stood at the edge of a new grave with her hands folded so tightly the knuckles had gone white. The pine box below her had cost more than she owned. The name carved into the small wooden marker was still fresh enough that a curl of shaved wood clung to the letter M. Behind her, at a careful distance, a half-circle of people from the town watched without stepping closer. A woman in a green shawl held a child by the shoulder and turned the child gently away. Two men in dark coats tipped their hats a quarter-inch and did not meet her eyes. The preacher had already finished his words and was walking back down the slope, his Bible tucked under his arm like something he wanted to be done with. Nobody offered her a hand. Nobody offered to help fill the grave. The shovel was left leaning against the pile of soil, as if the ground itself had decided this was her burden to carry alone. She waited until the last of them were far enough down the trail that the wind swallowed their footsteps, and then she picked up the shovel. Her arms burned before the first spadeful was turned. She was 26 years old, and until 7 days ago she had been a wife, and until 7 hours ago she had believed that the town of Hollow Fork was, in some small and imperfect way, still her home. She spoke her husband's name once, low, just under her breath. Thomas. The word came out cracked. She kept working. When she finally set the last of the earth in place, the sun had moved a full hand's width across the sky, and her palms had split open along the old callous lines she had earned bringing in 2 seasons of hay beside him. She did not cry. She had done all of her crying in the barn the night the fever took him, when there had still been someone to hear her. Halfway down the ridge, at the mouth of the trail where it opened onto the main street of Hollow Fork, she passed the front porch of Alderman's General Goods. Harlan Alderman himself was leaning on the doorframe with a broom in his hand. He had known her husband for 9 years. He had eaten at their table twice. He looked at her, and then he looked past her, and then he stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. The little brass bell above the door chimed as if nothing at all had happened. Across the street, the 2 women from the church quilting circle who had brought a basket of preserves to her wedding did not raise their eyes from the boardwalk. Ellen kept walking. Her boots were caked with the yellow-brown clay of the ridge. She could feel the town watching her the way a room watches a candle it does not intend to relight. The homestead sat 2 miles east of town, tucked into the low fold of land where Bitter Creek turned south. Thomas had built the cabin himself the winter before he married her, and the door still hung a little crooked because he had never quite trusted his own hinges. Inside, the fire had gone cold. A blue enamel cup sat on the table where he had set it down on the last morning he had been strong enough to stand. She did not touch it. She unlaced her boots by the door, hung her morning shawl on the peg he had cut for her out of a piece of cedar, and stood a long moment in the middle of the single room, listening to the small sounds a house makes when there is only one heartbeat left inside it. The rafters ticked. A mouse moved somewhere in the loft. The wind pressed against the north wall and let go. She opened the small tin box on the shelf above the stove where they kept what money they had. $3.42. A folded piece of paper with a merchant's tally on it. A silver locket that had been her mother's. She counted the coins twice. The number did not change. She sat down at the table and put her forehead against the wood and let herself breathe, because there was no one there to see her do it, and because she knew even then that breathing was the first thing a widow had to remember how to do on purpose. The next morning she rose before the sun and walked back into town. She had a list in her head. Flour, salt, coffee if there was any credit at all left in Thomas's name. A pane of glass for the kitchen window, which had cracked in the last frost and let a knife of cold air into the room every night. She pushed open the door of Alderman's General Goods, and the brass bell chimed the same friendly note it had chimed on the day Thomas first brought her into the store as his new wife. Harlan Alderman was behind the counter this time. He looked up. His face did something small and unhappy, and then it went smooth again. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. "Mr. Alderman," she said. "I'd like to draw against the account." He wet his lips. He looked down at the ledger in front of him. He turned 2 pages slowly, and then he closed it. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Marsh. The account has been settled." She did not understand him at first. Settled how? Closed out. Balance called in. By whom? He glanced at the door as if he wanted very badly for another customer to walk in. By the note holder. Thomas didn't hold a note with anyone but you. Ma'am, that's not correct. She stood very still. There was a long, slow moment in which she could hear the wall clock ticking behind him, and the distant creak of a wagon out on the street, and her own pulse in her ears. Mr. Alderman, she said carefully, my husband and I kept our books together. I know every dollar we owe. I know it because I wrote it down. Then I'm afraid, he said, and he did not finish the sentence. He turned the ledger toward her and slid it across the counter with the tip of one finger. He tapped a line. She bent to read it. The handwriting was not Thomas's. The signature at the bottom of the line was, though, or something that had been made to look enough like his that a man in a hurry would not question it. The amount written beside the signature was more money than the homestead was worth. She felt the blood leave her face. She held the counter with both hands. This isn't his hand. I'm sure it is, Mrs. Marsh. Who bought this note? Harlan Alderman looked at her for a full 3 seconds. There was something in his face that was not unkindness. It was closer to fear. You'd best speak to Mr. Pettibone at the bank, he said. That's all I can tell you. She walked out into the sunlight with the taste of tin in her mouth. The street was busier now. A pair of freight wagons had come in from the West Road and men were unloading crates of nails and bolts of muslin and sacks of seed corn. She stood a moment on the boardwalk trying to steady her breathing, and it was in that moment that she first saw the tall rider on the black horse at the far end of the street, waiting his turn at the freight office. He was not looking at her. He was looking at nothing in particular. He had the still, patient posture of a man who had learned a long time ago that hurrying rarely improved a situation. His coat was the color of old leather and his hat was pale with sun. She looked at him only for the length of a breath, and then she turned away and walked toward the bank. Ellery Pettibone kept the only bank in Hollow Fork. He was a soft-handed man with a very careful mustache and a habit of smiling with only the lower half of his face. He rose when Ellen entered his small paneled office and gestured her to a chair. He offered her tea. She refused it. Mr. Pettibone, there is a note against my husband's name at the general store. The signature is not his. The amount is not one I have ever seen. Ah, he said. He folded his hands on the blotter. Mrs. Marsh, please accept my condolences again. Your husband was a fine young man. The note, Mr. Pettibone. He sighed. He opened a drawer with a small brass key. He withdrew a bound sheaf of papers and set them precisely in front of her. The obligation was undertaken privately, in the year of your marriage. I am, at present, merely the collector of record. For whom? That I am not at liberty to say. He was my husband. And the debt, madam, is a matter between two parties, one of whom is now, as you know, unable to speak. As executor, you inherit the obligation, not the details. How long do I have? 3 weeks. She almost laughed. Came up in her throat like a hiccup and she pressed it back down. 3 weeks to pay a sum I cannot pay in 3 lifetimes. 3 weeks to vacate the property. Pettibone corrected, gently, as if he were correcting a child on the pronunciation of a word. The homestead has been named as security. If the balance is not settled by the 15th of the month, the property reverts to the note holder. She sat very still. She looked at the papers on his desk. She could feel her own hands wanting to shake and she would not let them. Who is the note holder, Mr. Pettibone? He smiled with the lower half of his face. Private party. Give me a name. Good day, Mrs. Marsh. She walked out onto the street and the sun was very bright and she could not remember, for a moment, which way was home. A boy pushed past her with a hoop and a stick. A dog barked somewhere behind the livery. She stood in front of the bank and it occurred to her, in a clear, cold way, that she had not eaten anything since the evening before Thomas died. She turned toward the boardwalk in front of the freight office because there was a bench there, and she thought that if she could sit down for one moment, she could think. The rider in the pale hat was still there. He was speaking with the freight clerk in a low, even voice, signing a paper against the counter. He glanced up as she passed. He did not look at her directly. He looked at her hands, at the split callus on her right palm, at the way she was holding her own left wrist as if to keep it from trembling. She sat down on the bench. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was a tin cup of water on the bench beside her. She looked around. The rider was already 10 steps down the boardwalk, walking toward his horse, his back to her. He did not turn around. She looked at the cup. She looked at his back. She picked up the cup and drank. The water was cold and clean and tasted faintly of the tin. She set the cup down carefully beside her. She did not know his name. She did not know that within a week she would be sitting at his table, or that within a month she would understand that the second plate he had set out that first evening had not been kindness alone. It had been something older and heavier and, in its own quiet way, something like an apology. The next 4 days passed in a way she would not later remember clearly. She walked to town twice more. Both times, doors that had opened for her in June closed for her in October. The blacksmith's wife, who had once braided her hair for her wedding, looked at the floor when Ellen walked past. The postmaster handed her a letter without a word and turned back to his sorting before she could ask if there was any other mail for her. She read the letter on the boardwalk. It was from Thomas's aunt in Missouri, who did not yet know that Thomas was dead, and who wrote in her looping careful hand that she hoped the crops had come in well and that Ellen was as happy as her nephew had promised she made him. Ellen folded the letter and put it in her pocket and did not cry. On the 5th day she woke before dawn and made a decision. She would ride out to the far ranches. She had heard, once, that some of the old cattlemen west of Bitter Creek did their own hiring for the winter, and that they sometimes took on a woman for the kitchen and the laundry and the mending when a wife was down or a cook had moved on. She did not want charity. She wanted work. She saddled the sorrel mare that Thomas had raised from a foal, and she rode west along the creek in the gray light before sunrise. Bitter Creek Valley opened out slowly. First there were only low bluffs and stands of cottonwood along the water. Then the country widened and the grass rolled long and pale toward the blue line of the hills. She passed 2 ranches. At the first, the foreman would not let her pass the gate. At the second, the rancher's wife came out onto the porch, listened to her without speaking, and then said, quite softly, that they had no work for a woman just now and that Ellen should try elsewhere. The rancher's wife did not meet her eyes either. Ellen understood, then, that whatever was moving through the town had reached the valley as well. Someone had put out a word about her. Someone had made certain that no door within 20 miles of Hollow Fork would open easily. She rode on because there was nothing else to do. The sun climbed. Her mare's neck darkened with sweat. The road narrowed. At the far end of the valley, where the hills began to fold in on the creek, she came to a gate made of 2 long peeled poles and a rope loop. Beyond the gate was a broad low ranch house of squared logs, a long barn, 3 corrals, and a windmill turning slowly in the noon breeze. There was no name on the gate. There was only, carved into the upper pole, a small mark that looked like a river bending back on itself. A tall man was standing beside the corral, leaning against the top rail, watching a young colt work a circle at the end of a long line. He wore a coat the color of old leather and a pale hat with a sun-worn brim. When he turned toward her, she recognized him. He was the man from the freight office, the man who had left a cup of water on the bench beside her. He did not smile. He touched the brim of his hat. "Mom." She sat her horse a moment. Then she said the thing she had come to say. "I'm Ellen Marsh. My husband was Thomas Marsh. He passed a week ago. I'm looking for work." He listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he looked past her at the road she had come in on, as if he were counting the miles. Then he looked at her mare and at her hands and at the small bundle tied behind her saddle, and he said, "Silas Beaumont, come down off that horse, Mrs. Marsh. You've ridden a long way for one morning." She hesitated. He waited. He did not push. Finally she dismounted, and her legs almost gave under her, and he did not step forward to catch her arm, which she was grateful for, because if he had touched her she would not have known how to hold herself together. He nodded once, as if he had seen her decide to stand, and he said, "There's a bench by the pump. Water your mare. I'll be inside." She led the mare to the pump. She worked the handle. The water came up cold and sweet. The mare drank. Ellen stood with her hand on the mare's neck and looked at the low ranch house with its wide porch and its 2 square windows and its door standing half open, and she thought, distantly, that she had not stood on a porch that was not her own since her wedding day. Silas Beaumont did not appear again for a quarter of an hour. When he did, he was carrying a tin plate in one hand and a tin cup in the other. He set them on the small pine table on the porch. There was a piece of brown bread on the plate, and a wedge of yellow cheese and 3 slices of cold roast beef. The cup held coffee. He set a second plate beside it. His own plate had the same food in the same portions. He sat down on the far side of the table and gestured to the near chair. "I don't take charity, Mr. Beaumont." "It isn't charity, Mrs. Marsh. It's dinner. I was going to eat anyway." Half the table was empty. She stood a moment. She looked at the food. She had not eaten a real meal in 6 days. Her legs were still trembling from the ride. She sat down. They ate in silence for a while. He did not ask her questions. He did not offer condolences. He ate the way a man eats who has decided that eating is a thing worth doing carefully. When he was finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and he said, without looking up, "You've been to the other ranches." "Yes." "They turned you off." "Yes." "You know why?" "No." "Not fully." He nodded once. He set his cup down. He looked, at last, directly at her, and his eyes were a kind of gray that was almost blue in the porch light, and they were very tired. "Mrs. Marsh, I don't hire for the winter. I run this place with 2 hands and I don't need a third. But I have a spare room off the kitchen that's been empty for 4 years. And there's a woman in town who used to keep house for my father who cannot climb the stairs any longer. If you're willing to cook a supper a day and see to the linen, and keep the ledger of what goes in and out of the kitchen larder, there's a bed for you and a wage of $6 a month and half of this table for as long as you want the seat." She could not speak for a moment. She looked at her hands in her lap. She looked at the half loaf of brown bread on the plate. She said, "When she could, why?" He was silent a long moment. "Because," he said finally, "nobody offered your husband a chair once either." She looked up sharply. "You knew Thomas?" "I knew of him." "How?" He did not answer that. He stood up. He gathered the plates. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "The door is unlocked. If you'd like to see it before you decide, you're welcome. If you'd rather ride back to town and think on it, that's welcome too. I'll be at the corral." He went back down the porch steps. He did not look back. She sat a long moment at the table with the wind moving quietly in the eaves. She could hear the colt in the corral kicking a small stone against the fence rail. She could hear the windmill turning. She stood up. She walked into the ranch house. The room off the kitchen was small and clean. A narrow rope bed under a window. A wooden chair. A wash basin on a small stand. A hook on the wall for a coat. A cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hands on her knees and, for the first time in 7 days, she began to cry. It was not a loud crying. It was the slow, steady kind. The kind that comes out of a person who has been holding herself upright for far longer than her strength was meant to last. She cried until her breath was even again. Then she stood up. She washed her face in the basin. She walked back out to the corral. Silas Beaumont was leaning on the top rail again, watching the colt. He did not turn. "I'll stay," she said. He nodded once, still watching the colt. "Supper's at 6, he said. "The larder key is on the peg by the stove." That was how it began. The first week, she did not speak to him unless he spoke to her first. She rose at 4, laid the kitchen fire, mixed the biscuits, ground the coffee, and had breakfast ready on the long plank table by 5:30. Silas and his 2 hands, a lean older man named Wick Palmer and a quiet young Mexican vaquero named Tomas Herrera, came in from the barn with the smell of hay and horses on them, ate quickly, and were gone again before the sun was up. She kept the kitchen ledger in a small leather book. She noted every pound of flour, every tin of salt, every measure of sugar. In the afternoons, she washed and mended the linen and swept the porch and split the kindling for the stove. At 6, she set the long table with 4 places. Silas came in last. He hung his hat on the peg by the door. He washed his hands in the basin. He sat down at the head of the table. She sat at the far end. Wick and Tomas sat on the sides. They ate. There was very little talk. But every night, at the beginning of the meal, Silas would look down the length of the table, and he would nod at her once, and he would say in the same steady voice, "Thank you, Mrs. Marsh." And she would nod back and she would say, "Mr. Beaumont." And that would be the whole of it. On the 9th day, she found the letter. She had been going through the pockets of Thomas's old riding coat, which she had brought with her from the homestead. She meant to mend a tear in the lining and put the coat away for the winter. Her fingers, working along the inside seam, felt a stiffness where there should not have been one. She turned the coat inside out. A small square of folded paper had been sewn into the lining, just below the collar, where a man would only notice it if he were looking for it, and where a wife going through her husband's pockets would not, because a wife did not go through the lining. She sat down on the edge of the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen. She unfolded the paper carefully. It was a letter. It was in Thomas's hand. It was addressed to her. It was dated 3 weeks before he had fallen ill. "Ellen," it read, "if you are reading this, I have not had the courage to tell you what I know, or I have not had the time. Either way, I am sorry. There is a man in Hollow Fork who has been putting his name on notes that are not his notes. Ellery Pettibone knows. I believe he is a party to it. I have found 3 farms in the valley whose deeds have moved to a private party in the past 2 years, always after a death, always after a signature that the widow does not recognize. I did not know how to tell you without frightening you. I meant to speak to a lawyer in Cheyenne. If I did not have the time to do that, then please, my love, take this letter and take yourself to Judge Nathaniel or in Laramie. Do not trust Pettibone. Do not trust the sheriff. And do not trust the man who owns the ranch at the west end of Bitter Creek Valley. He is called Beaumont now, but he was not always called Beaumont. His true name is Silas Renfro, and his brother is the man behind this. I love you. Whatever you do, do not stay in Hollow Fork." She read the letter 3 times. The second time, her hands began to shake. The third time, she made them stop. She folded the paper. She put it inside the small silver locket that had been her mother's. She closed the locket. She placed it in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, under a folded blanket. She sat very still on the edge of the bed for a long time. Then she got up. She washed her face. She went into the kitchen. She set the table for supper. When Silas came in and hung his hat on the peg and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Marsh," she nodded back and she said, "Mr. Beaumont," and she did not let her eyes rest on his face any longer than usual, and he did not seem to notice anything at all. That night, she lay awake with her hands folded on the coverlet and her eyes on the ceiling boards, and she thought about the letter. She thought about the way Silas had said, "Nobody offered your husband a chair once either." She thought about the small mark on the upper gatepost, the mark like a river bending back on itself. She thought about the fact that a man who had changed his name did not do so lightly. She thought about Ellery Pettibone's careful mustache and Harlan Alderman's frightened face, and about the way the whole town of Hollow Fork had closed around her like a fist. And she thought, at last, that she did not know yet whether Silas Beaumont was her enemy or her only ally, but she knew that she could not run tonight, and she knew that she could not run tomorrow, and she knew that she could not run until she understood what her husband had been trying to tell her. So she would stay. She would watch. She would set the table. She would keep the ledger. And she would wait for the man who had offered her half his table to show her, in his own time, what half he intended to keep for himself. On the 12th day, a rider came up the road at dusk. Ellen was on the porch beating the dust out of a rug when she saw him. He was a heavy-set man on a bay horse, riding easy, with a long dark coat and a bowler hat, which was a hat no one in Bitter Creek Valley wore. He drew up at the gate and did not dismount. He waited. Silas came out of the barn. He walked to the gate without hurrying. The 2 men spoke a while. Ellen could not hear the words. She saw Silas stand very still. She saw the rider gesture, once with a gloved hand, back toward Hollow Fork. She saw Silas shake his head, one small tight shake, and she saw the rider laugh, and she saw Silas not laugh. Then the rider turned his horse and rode back down the road, and Silas stood at the gate a long moment before he came back to the barn, and when he came back his shoulders were set in a way Ellen had not seen before. At supper that evening he did not say, "Thank you, Mrs. Marsh." He sat down. He looked at his plate. He looked up. He said, "Wick, Tomas, from tonight on, one of you stays at the barn until moonrise. Take shifts. Wick Palmer looked up sharply. Trouble? A message from town. Tomas said quietly, which kind of message? Silas glanced, just once, down the length of the table at Ellen. Then he looked back at his plate. The kind that asks a man to send someone away. Wick set his fork down. And you told him no. I did. Nothing more was said about it that night. But when Ellen cleared the plates, she saw that Silas had barely eaten, and she saw that Tomas had slipped a small revolver into the waistband of his trousers before he went back out into the dark, and she understood that whatever had been quiet under the surface of Bitter Creek Valley was now moving. She waited until Silas was on the porch alone that evening. He was smoking, which he did rarely, and only when he was thinking. She stepped out. She stood beside him. She did not look at him. She said, "The rider." Who was he? He did not answer at first. He drew on the pipe. He let the smoke out slowly. He said, "A man who works for a man who wants my ranch. For your ranch. For a piece of it. For the water rights on the North Bend. For the pasture behind the ridge." Bit by bit, over the years, he has bought a great many pieces of a great many ranches. And now yours. He has been trying for a long time. He has never been able to. Now he thinks he has found a way. Through me. Silas was quiet. "Mr. Beaumont," she said. "Who is he?" He looked at her then. In the porch lantern light his eyes were very tired. "Mrs. Marsh. I owe you a longer answer than the one I can give you tonight. But I will tell you this. The man who holds the note on your homestead, and the man who sent the rider to my gate tonight, and the man who has been buying up widows' deeds in this valley for 2 years, they are the same man. And I have known him a long time." "How long?" He was silent again. Then he said quietly, "All my life." She waited. He did not go on. She said, "At last, you are not going to tell me tonight." "No." "Will you tell me?" "Yes." "When it is time." "When is it time, Mr. Beaumont?" He looked out into the dark toward the road. He said, "When you can leave this porch safely if you want to." "Not before." She stood a while longer. Then she said, "Good night, Mr. Beaumont." "Good night, Mrs. Marsh." She went inside. She closed the door of the small room off the kitchen. She opened the cedar chest. She took out the silver locket. She held it in her hand a long time. Then she put it back, and she went to bed, and she slept for the first time in 9 days without dreaming. The days grew shorter. The cottonwoods along the creek turned the color of hammered brass and then let their leaves go. Ellen learned the ranch. She learned that Wick Palmer had lost a wife to cholera in Missouri 20 years before and had not spoken of her since, but that he kept a small tintype of her in the pocket of his vest. She learned that Tomas Herrera had a younger sister in a mission school in Santa Fe and sent her $3 of his wages every month, and that he had come north because his father had told him, on his deathbed, that a man should see country his father had never seen. She learned that Silas Beaumont rose every morning at 4, worked until noon without stopping, ate a plate of cold beef and bread standing up, and then rode out again until dark. She learned that he read at night by the fire and that his books were unexpected: a volume of Marcus Aurelius, a battered book of English poetry, a treatise on the raising of shorthorn cattle, and, on a low shelf all its own, a small worn Bible with a name written inside the front cover in a woman's careful hand. She did not read the name. She wanted to. She did not. On the 3rd Sunday of her stay, a small thing happened that changed her. A wagon came up the road in the middle of the afternoon. It was a poor wagon drawn by a thin mule. The man driving it was a homesteader from the far south end of the valley, a man named Corbin Yates, whose wife had died in childbirth in the spring and who had been trying, with very little success, to raise a 2-year-old daughter on his own. The little girl was in the back of the wagon, wrapped in a blanket. She was burning with fever. Corbin Yates had ridden 3 hours to reach the ranch because, he said, the doctor in Hollow Fork had refused to come out to see her without payment in advance, and he had no payment. Silas listened to him without interrupting. Then he said, "Wick, saddle the gray. Tomas, ride to Doc Merriweather's and tell him I will guarantee the fee. Mrs. Marsh, if you would be so kind as to make up the small bed in the kitchen room. You have a guest already," Corbin Yates said, glancing at Ellen. Silas said, "Mrs. Marsh, I'm asking you to move to the loft above the kitchen for a night or 2. If you are willing." "I am willing," Ellen said. She carried her things up the ladder to the loft. She made up the bed downstairs with fresh linen. She warmed a pot of broth and cooled it. She sat with the child through the evening while the men rode out and rode back, and while Doc Merriweather, who had come after all, worked over the small hot body with cool cloths and a spoonful of quinine. Silas sat in the kitchen the whole night, at the plank table, with his hands folded, and did not sleep. Ellen sat with the child. The fever broke a little before dawn. The child opened her eyes and looked at Ellen and reached one small hand up and touched Ellen's cheek. And Ellen held the small hand and did not, for a long moment, know how to breathe. It had been almost 2 years since she had held a child's hand. She and Thomas had lost a baby very early, in the second winter of their marriage. She had never told anyone, not even Thomas's mother. She held Corbin Yates's daughter's hand until the child slept again. Then she stood up. She went into the kitchen. Silas was still at the table. He looked at her once, and she saw that he had understood, without her saying anything, some part of what she was carrying, and she saw that he was not going to speak of it, and she was grateful. At dawn, Corbin Yates carried his sleeping daughter out to the wagon. He tried to thank Silas. Silas would not accept the thanks. He put a small parcel of biscuits and a jar of honey in the back of the wagon. He said, "Come back Sunday. Bring the child. Mrs. Marsh will look after her while you and I speak." Corbin Yates looked at him. He said, "I have nothing to pay you with, Mr. Beaumont." Silas said, "I did not ask you to pay me." The wagon went down the road. Ellen stood on the porch. Silas stood beside her. She did not look at him. She said quietly, "You do this often." He did not answer. She said, "You have done it for others." "Yes." "For widows. Sometimes. For me." He turned his face away. "For you," he said, "I would have done more if I had known sooner." She was silent a while. Then she said, "Mr. Beaumont, I am going to ask you one question. I would like you to answer it truthfully. Did you know my husband?" There was a long pause. The wind moved in the cottonwoods. He said, "At last, I met him once. In Cheyenne. 6 months ago. He came to see me. He asked me questions about a man. I answered as truthfully as I could. He rode back to Hollow Fork. I did not see him again." "What man did he ask you about?" Silas was silent. "Mr. Beaumont," he said very quietly, "my brother." She had known. Somewhere under the 9th day and the letter and the folded paper in the locket, she had known. But hearing him say it aloud was a different thing. She held to the porch rail. She said, "Your brother is the man who holds the note on my homestead." "Yes." "Your brother is the man who has been buying widows' deeds in this valley." "Yes." "Your brother is the reason my husband is dead." Silas said, "I do not know that. I would not say that. Not without proof. Fever is fever. But I will say this. My brother wanted your husband silent. And your husband is silent now. I do not know if my brother is a murderer. I know he is a thief. I know he is a forger. I know he has been building his fortune on the losses of others for a great many years. And I know that I left him 21 years ago and swore I would not carry his name." "What was his name?" "Renfro. Cassius Renfro." She closed her eyes. She could see, behind her closed eyes, Ellery Pettibone's careful mustache. She could see Harlan Alderman's frightened face. She could hear Thomas's voice in the letter, careful and small and afraid, warning her. He is called Beaumont now, but he was not always called Beaumont. She opened her eyes. "You should have told me on the first day, Mr. Beaumont." "Yes," he said. "I should have." "Why did you not?" He looked at her at last. "Because," he said, "if I had told you on the first day, you would not have stayed. And if you had not stayed, you would not have lived to see the second week. My brother had already sent men into the town to watch you. The moment you were seen to be alone and desperate, he would have moved. I could not stop him from moving. I could only make you inconvenient to reach. By hiring me, by seating you at my table." She was quiet a long moment. She said, "So the half of the table you offered me was a shield," he said. "Yes, it was a shield first. It is other things now. But it began as a shield." She looked at him. She looked at the porch rail under her hand. She looked out toward the road where Corbin Yates's wagon was disappearing between the cottonwoods. She said, "Mr. Beaumont, I would like to see the letter my husband sent to Judge Nathaniel, or, if it was ever sent. He looked at her sharply. You know about the judge. My husband left me a letter, sewn into the lining of his coat. I have it in the cedar chest. Silas was silent for a long moment. Then he said, Mrs. Marsh, would you show me that letter? She said, yes. She brought the locket out to the porch. She unfolded the paper. She handed it to him. He read it. He read it twice. When he handed it back to her, his hands were not entirely steady. He said, your husband was a braver man than I understood. Yes, she said. He was. He never reached judge or... No. Silas said, then we will reach judge or for him. She looked at him. He said, Mrs. Marsh, if you will allow me, I would like to ride to Laramie next week. I would like to take this letter and the kitchen ledger from your homestead, and the deed papers, and the 2 other widows in this valley whose farms have been taken, and I would like to lay it all before judge or... I cannot do it without your consent. The letter is yours. The choice is yours. She thought a long moment. She said, you will not go alone. No, I will go with you. He almost smiled. He did not. He said, it is a hard ride. I have made hard rides. There will be danger on the road. There is danger on this porch. He inclined his head. He said, then we will go together. They rode out 4 days later at first light, before the frost had lifted from the grass. Wick Palmer stayed at the ranch. Tomas Herrera rode with them as far as the ferry crossing on the North Platte. There they parted. Tomas rode north to fetch a document from a rancher's widow named Marta Halloran, whose husband had died the year before under circumstances that the sheriff of Hollow Fork had declined to investigate. Silas and Ellen rode south along the Laramie Road, through country that was almost empty and very beautiful, cold in the mornings and warm at noon, and where they camped at night beside small clear streams and did not speak more than they needed to. On the 3rd night they were sitting by a small fire, and Ellen said quietly, Silas. It was the first time she had said his given name. He looked up. She said, tell me about your brother. He was quiet a long time. Then he told her. He told her about a farmhouse in eastern Kansas, and 2 boys who had grown up in it, and a mother who had died young, and a father who had drunk himself into an early grave, and an older brother who had learned very early that the world was a thing to be taken from, and a younger brother who had believed, foolishly, that the world was a thing to be met. He told her about a night, when he was 19 and Cassius was 23, when Cassius had come home with a saddlebag full of money that had not been his, and about the choice Silas had made the next morning, which was to leave and to keep leaving, and to change his name to his mother's maiden name, and to build, in the far quiet valley of Bitter Creek, a small clean life that had nothing of his brother in it. He had not seen Cassius in 21 years. But he had heard, over the years, that Cassius had come west, and that Cassius had prospered, and that Cassius had built a small empire out of small cruelties, and that Cassius had, at last, come to Hollow Fork. Silas had known, when the town first began to close its doors to widows and to farmers in trouble, whose hand was behind it. He had not been able to stop it. He had not, until the morning of the freight office, understood how to. He had watched Ellen cross the boardwalk with her split callus and her trembling wrist, and he had thought, this one I will not let him take. Ellen listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, I am glad you left him. He said, I have been ashamed of leaving him, for most of my life, because I did not stop him. She said, you are stopping him now. He looked into the fire. He said, we are stopping him now. She said, yes. They rode into Laramie on the 6th day. Judge Nathaniel was a small, dry man with white hair and very clear blue eyes. He read Thomas Marsh's letter. He read the widow Halloran's affidavit, which Tomas Herrera had delivered by the fastest rider in the county. He examined the kitchen ledger from the Marsh homestead and compared it against the ledger from Alderman's General Goods, which Harlan Alderman had, at the last moment and under an oath he had not been asked to swear, sent along by post. He compared the forged signature on the note against 3 genuine signatures from Thomas Marsh's own hand. He compared the handwriting on the forged note against samples of Ellery Pettibone's hand, which had been supplied by the postmaster in Hollow Fork, who, it turned out, had been keeping his own small quiet ledger for a year and a half, because a postmaster sees more than most men, and this postmaster had not liked what he had been seeing. Judge or set down his glasses. He said, "Mrs. Marsh, Mr. Beaumont, I will issue a bench warrant for the arrest of Ellery Pettibone on charges of forgery, conspiracy, and fraud. I will issue a summons for Cassius Renfro on the same charges, and on the additional charge of receiving stolen property. I will convene an inquest in Hollow Fork within the fortnight, and I will personally accompany you to the town meeting on the 15th of next month, at which the note against the Marsh homestead is due to be called." He looked at Ellen over the top of his glasses. He said, "Young woman, you have done a very brave thing." She said, "My husband did it. I only carried it the last mile." He said, "That, Mrs. Marsh, is what most bravery is." They rode back to Bitter Creek in the first snow. It came thin and slow over the pass, and by the time they reached the ranch there was a white powder on the porch rail and a cold blue smoke coming out of the kitchen chimney where Wick Palmer had kept the fire going. Wick met them at the gate. He said, "There have been 3 riders on the road since you left. All 3 from Hollow Fork. All 3 turned back at the fork above the creek. Tomas is inside. He came back yesterday." Silas said, "Any word from town?" Wick said, "Pettibone knows something is moving. He has not yet moved himself. The town is very quiet." Silas said, "It will not be quiet on the 15th. The morning of the 15th was cold and clear. The town of Hollow Fork was fuller than it had been in months. Every homesteader from Bitter Creek Valley had come in. Every widow of the past 2 years had come in. Corbin Yates had come in with his daughter on his hip. Marta Halloran had come in with the ledger she had been keeping in secret since her husband's death. The postmaster had come in with his small quiet book. Judge Nathaniel had come in with 2 deputies from the federal marshal's office at Cheyenne, and with a sheaf of papers under his arm. The town meeting was held in the church because the town hall could not hold the crowd. Ellery Pettibone arrived with his careful mustache and his lower half smile. He did not know yet that his life had ended. He took his usual seat at the front. Sheriff Aldous Crane sat beside him. Cassius Renfro was not there. Cassius Renfro, they would learn later, had left Hollow Fork on a fast horse the night before, when he had at last understood which way the wind had turned. Judge Nathaniel rose. He read the forged note against Thomas Marsh. He read the true kitchen ledger from the Marsh homestead. He read Thomas Marsh's letter to his wife. He read Marta Halloran's affidavit. He read the postmaster's book. He named Ellery Pettibone. He named Cassius Renfro. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he was done, Ellery Pettibone was on his feet, and then he was not on his feet because the deputies had crossed the aisle and taken him by the elbows, and the lower half of his smile had gone entirely, and the upper half had, at last, caught up with the truth of the matter. Sheriff Aldous Crane resigned that afternoon. He was not arrested. There was not enough against him. But he did not stay in Hollow Fork. He rode east the next morning, and no one in the valley saw him again. Cassius Renfro was arrested 6 weeks later, in a town in the Dakota Territory, by a marshal who had been carrying Judge summons in his saddlebag. He was tried in Cheyenne in the spring. He was convicted. He was sentenced. He served his sentence in full. He did not come back to Bitter Creek Valley. The homestead was restored to Ellen Marsh. The 2 other widows' deeds were restored also. The town of Hollow Fork, in the weeks after the meeting, did a thing that towns rarely do. It turned, in a slow, embarrassed way, back toward the woman it had abandoned. Harlan Alderman came out to the ranch one Sunday with a basket of apples and stood on the porch with his hat in his hand and said, "Mrs. Marsh, I am sorry. I was afraid. That is not a reason. That is only what happened. I am sorry." Ellen took the basket. She invited him in for coffee. She did not quite forgive him. She did not quite refuse to. She poured him a cup. She sat across from him. She let him sit. That was the beginning of what would, over the next year, become something like peace. She did not go back to the homestead to live. She rode out one afternoon in the late spring with Silas, and they walked through the small cabin together, and she stood a long time in the kitchen where Thomas's blue enamel cup still sat on the table. She picked up the cup. She held it in her hand. She set it down. She said, "I would like to keep this place, but I do not want to live in it." Silas said, "You can lease it." There is a young couple in from Missouri looking for a homestead. Good people. I know the man's cousin, she said. Then that is what we will do. They rode back to the ranch in the long evening light. They did not speak much. There was not, by now, much that needed to be said. Silas Beaumont did not ask her to marry him for another 11 months. He was not a man who moved quickly on any question that mattered. When he did ask, he asked her on the porch at dusk, with the same tin cup of water he had once left on a bench in front of the freight office. He did not kneel. He did not make a speech. He said, "Ellen, I would like it very much if this porch was your porch. Not because I am on it, because you belong on it. I would like the same for the ranch, and for the ledger, and for the seat at the far end of the table, and, if you will allow it, for the seat at the head of it whenever you would rather sit there. I have loved you since the morning you rode in. I have not said so because I did not want you to feel that half of the table was ever anything less than yours, freely." She looked at him. She said, "Silas." He waited. She said, "You are a very slow man." He said, "I know." She said, "I am glad." He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "It is a yes." They were married in the church at Hollow Fork, quietly, on the first day of June. Judge Nathaniel Orr came up from Laramie for the ceremony and stood as a witness. Corbin Yates's small daughter, now 3 years old and walking, carried a bunch of wild blue lupin down the aisle and gave it, gravely and with great concentration, to Ellen. Wick Palmer wept, which no one in Bitter Creek Valley had ever seen him do, and did not apologize for it. Tomas Herrera played a small tune on a wooden flute that his father had made for him 30 years before, and it was, all of them agreed afterward, the sweetest sound the church had ever held. That evening, back at the ranch, Ellen set the long plank table for supper. She set 4 plates. Then she paused. She looked at the 4th plate a long moment. She picked it up. She carried it to the far end of the table, where she had, for so many months, sat as a woman at half a table. She set the plate down at that far end. She went back to the head of the table. She set another plate there, for herself. She stood a moment looking down the length of the wood. 2 plates at the head, 2 plates in the middle, and, at the far end, an empty setting, a plate and a cup and a fork and a knife, laid out carefully and left empty. Silas came in. He hung his hat on the peg. He washed his hands. He looked at the table. He looked at the empty setting at the far end. He looked at her. He did not ask. She said, "That one is for Thomas." He nodded. She said, "It will be there every night." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is that all right with you?" He said, "Ellen, there is room at this table for every person we have loved. There will always be room." They sat down to supper. Wick Palmer said grace, which he did not usually do. Tomas Herrera passed the bread. The wind moved in the cottonwoods outside. The lamps burned. The empty plate at the far end of the table caught the lantern light and shone a soft gold, the way any well-tended thing will shine when it is loved. A year later, a small boy was born to them, in the spring, in the bedroom that had once been the small room off the kitchen. They named him Thomas Silas Beaumont. He grew up in that ranch house. He grew up knowing that there had been a man before his father, and that the man had been brave, and that the man had a plate at the far end of the table, and that the plate was not a sadness. It was a thanks. The morning after his son was born, Silas Beaumont walked out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee in his hands. Ellen was already there, wrapped in a woolen shawl, sitting on the porch bench in the first pale gold of the sun. He set 1 cup on the porch rail beside her. He kept the other for himself. They did not speak for a long moment. The valley was very still. Somewhere down the road, a meadowlark called. A slow, cool wind moved through the cottonwoods and let go. Ellen said, quietly, "Silas." "Yes." "Thank you for the seat at the table." He looked at her. He looked at the 2 cups on the porch rail. He looked at the road that ran east toward Hollow Fork and west toward the hills. He said, "Thank you for sitting down." The coffee cooled slowly in the morning air. Neither of them was in any hurry to drink it. They sat there together until the sun cleared the ridge and the light moved down the long grass of Bitter Creek Valley, and if you had ridden by that morning, you would have seen only what any passing traveler would have seen. A man and a woman on a porch at sunrise, two tin cups on the rail between them, and on the other side of the open door, faintly visible through the kitchen window, a long plank table with a fourth plate laid at the far end, and a small blue enamel cup set beside it, catching the light. If the story stayed with you, I'd love to know in the comments which moment you felt most deeply. The shovel on the ridge, the tin cup on the bench, the letter in the coat lining, or the plate that never leaves the far end of the table. And if you enjoy quiet, original frontier stories about grief that becomes courage and strangers who become family, there is another one waiting for you when you are ready. Ride safe, sit down when you can, and save a seat for the people you have loved.